Greetings, Seahawks. Welcome to our Black History Month Student Live featuring the historic Overtown, past and present. Today's featured speaker is Dr. Marvin Dunn. Dr. Marvin Dunn is a native Floridian, is Professor Emeritus and retired Chairman of the Department of Psychology at Florida International University. Born during the Jim Crow era, he brings a perspective to Black history that has been missed, distorted, and minimalized in the past. He co-authored The Miami Riot of 1980, Crossing the Bounds, published 1984, authored Black Miami in the 20th Century, published 1997, and A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, published 2016. Dr. Dunn appears regularly on local and national television broadcasts, providing insight on race issues in America. He has been published in major newspapers, and he is a nationally respected scholar, author, historian, and community activist in race and ethnic relations. He lives in Miami, Florida currently. And Dr. Dunn, thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Tiffany, and Student Life for this opportunity. And also thank you, Broward College, for allowing me to speak today on the subject of Black Miami history, how we evolved in Miami in the early years, particularly with an emphasis on Overtown. So let's get started with the first slide. Our topic is Overtown. Overtown is the original Black community in Miami, and its history is not well known. Today, we will explore it in some detail. Next slide. Who were the people who were first to settle in, Black people who were first to settle in South Florida? Well, the first people who stayed for a while were the Bahamians who came up through the Florida Keys. Many of them settled in Coconut Grove. So Coconut Grove back in the 1880s had a very thriving Black Bahamian community. The folks who came up the Keys to settle eventually in Key West and then in Miami, in Coconut Grove, came from the Bahamas primarily to pick pineapples. These two individuals were photographed on Plantation Key in the 1880s. They were among the first Blacks to come from the Bahamas to work in the pineapple industry. The pineapple industry was based in the Keys. As a matter of fact, pineapples grew all the way up to Fort Pierce, and that industry attracted a lot of Bahamians, other farming jobs as well. And some of them stayed, and some of them went back to the Bahamas. And that began the really settlement of Bahamians in South Florida, starting in Coconut Grove. Now, the African-American community really began coming here after an event called the Great Freeze. It happened in 1894 and 1895. This is a photograph that was taken in DeLand, Florida, where I was born actually, after this freeze took place. It was horrendous. Fish froze in the Florida Bay. The trains couldn't operate. Thousands of cattle were killed. So a lot of farmers, white farmers, believed that they needed to move south to prevent being caught above the freeze line again. And this began the interest of developing a town in South Florida that would be below the freeze line. Julia Tuttle was a white woman from Ohio. She is credited as being the mother of Miami. She owned land that is basically downtown Miami today, and sold part of her land to the Flagler Railroad, run by Henry Morrison Flagler, one of the richest men in the world at that time. He had made his money in oil and then invested in the Florida East Coast Railroad. A railroad from Jacksonville all the way down the Florida East Coast to Palm Beach, actually. And before this freeze happened, that's where he stopped the railroad. But legend has it that after this freeze took place, Julia Tuttle, this lady who now owned the major port of downtown Miami, offered her land to Flagler for the purpose of starting a town. That's why she's recognized as the mother of Miami. Flagler then authorized a group of men to come to the Miami River to begin a city. They didn't have a name for it at the time, but Flagler saw the benefit after that freeze of economic progress that could be had in Florida, farming, particularly in South Bay County. His plan was to develop the farming industry, agricultural industry in South Florida, and use his trains to transport vegetables and fruits to the north, and therefore make a lot of money, which turned out to be true. He also planned to bring tourists from the north down to South Florida. He had been doing that with his railroad all along the coast, but it stopped at Palm Beach until the freeze happened, and Julia Tuttle convinced him that she would share her land with the railroad if he would bring it on down to South Florida. So this photograph was taken at the Miami River at a place right that was known, actually, it was in later years, the parking lot of the DuPont Plaza Hotel, right on where the Miami River empties into the bay. And this is a photograph of the first 12 Black men who were brought to what became Overtown in 1896 after that freeze happened. Now you'll see in this photograph about 5 white men in the background standing around. They're not working, of course. The Black men have wheelbarrows that they're filling with what appears to be soil, but it's not. This hill that you're looking at was really an ancient Tequesta Indian burial mound. And what these men are doing at the direction of the railroad boss is dumping bones that they're digging up into the bay to make way for Flagler's Royal Palm Hotel, which was built on that spot. It was an incredible act of desecration. The Tequesta Indians had been living in Florida for thousands of years before white people came, before the city of Miami started. And this is just a terrible act, but in those days, it didn't matter. These 12 men were given tents in the northwest quadrant of the new town to live in, and that section eventually became Overtown. It was the Negro quarters. Now, let me point this out as we go forward. What the railroad did as it came down was to establish in the northwest quadrants of these towns that were developing along the railroad for Negroes. So a Black person who came in with the railroad, and the railroad brought in a lot of Black laborers, they had to live in that northwest section of these towns as they developed. So for this reason, today, Fort Lauderdale has African Americans living in the northwest quadrant of Fort Lauderdale. In West Palm Beach, African Americans live in the northwest quadrant of West Palm Beach. So on down the line. It was a plan implemented by the railroad to systematically, geographically segregate Blacks. What they wanted, and this is a shot of Overtown, Town, taken around 1920. What they wanted was to make sure that Black people could get to downtown by walking to their jobs to support the hotel and other things, maids and what have you, but far enough away to be out of sight of white tourists and white people. And that then was the rationale used to segregate these communities physically. And then once these segregated Black communities were set up in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach, and so forth, Black people had certain restrictions that applied. For example, you couldn't really cross a railroad track at night. The Black sections were always on the other side of the railroad track without the risk of being arrested. You couldn't buy property outside of the Negro quadrant. And very few people had money to buy property anyway. One of the ones who did have money to buy property was this man. P.A. Dorsey, Daniel A. Dorsey, came to Miami right after that freeze. It wasn't called Miami then. He came from Quitman, Georgia, mainly by raft alone. Took him months to get here. But Mr. Dorsey was the carpenter. He was not well educated. Grade, but he came down and started working, doing common labor, saving his money and buying up little lots of land, pieces of land, and building houses, we call them shotgun houses, for the Black folks who were coming into this new community. By this time, it was called Miami. That was because when the railroad wanted to have a city established, they had to use the black men who worked for the railroad, who were voters. Women didn't have to vote at that time. Come in and give their vote for the official starting of the city of Miami. So over 150 men, black men, were participants in the initial incorporation of the city of Miami. After they voted for the incorporation of the city of Miami, they were dismissed. Blacks had no voting power until many years later, as we will discover going down the line. But these are the kinds of houses that Mr. Dorsey built. They were generally, they're called shotgun houses because you could stand theoretically in the front yard, fire a shotgun through the front door, and the bullets wouldn't touch into the walls or come out the back. All of these houses were built the same way. And Mr. Dorsey and a few other black landlords made money by renting these homes to blacks who came in mainly as railroad workers. I do want to point out, though, that at this time, 40% of the black population in Overtown was Bahamian. So even though the freeze caused many African Americans to move down to this new city, Bahamians were already here, and they also moved into this is Mr. Dorsey's house. It is still standing in Overtown. Mr. Dorsey was superintendent of education for colored students, as a matter of fact, even though he had limited education himself. So if you wanted to teach in Miami, you were a black person, you came to his house, he interviewed you, and if he said you could teach, then you could. If not, then you weren't allowed to. One other thing about Mr. Dorsey and the Dorsey family is that D.A. Dorsey was the only black person when cars came out who was allowed to own an automobile. Black people couldn't just go and buy an automobile. White people couldn't figure out what would a black person need with a car. But Dorsey was able to buy a new Cadillac each year and had a chauffeur drive him around to collect his rent from the folks who owed him money. There was a black woman named Florence Gaston. This is not her. She came into Miami about the same time that Dorsey arrived. She came from Jacksonville. Florence Gaston was a very large black lady who came in and opened a laundry business. And what Miss Gaston did was she would collect the white people's laundry at the Royal Palm Hotel that Flagler built, this magnificent building, bring the clothes to Colored Town, Overtown, and distribute them to several women who would wash these clothes and iron them, and then Ms. Gaston would pick them up and take them back to the hotel to the white folks. And therefore, she had money to then give to these women who did this work. So that was one way of earning money that many black women took advantage of that. A lot of black people in my generation and later were put through college by women doing this kind of work. That's Booker T. Washington Senior High School. It opened in 1927. Before 1927, a black child in Miami could not go past the 8th grade. White children had Miami High that went through 12th grade. But if you were black, up until 1927, to get a high school diploma, you had to leave Miami. Many black parents sent from the Bahamas, sent their children to Nassau to finish high school. Many African-American parents sent their children to Bethune-Cookman or to Edward Waters or to Fisk or Morehouse. In those days, black colleges, many of them had more black high school students than college students because black high schools did not exist in great numbers in the South in the 1920s and 30s. But Booker T. Washington was the first one built in Miami for blacks. That's the old building. In order for that building to go up, I was told, black men had to sit with guns and guard that property because white people couldn't figure out what would a black person need with a high school diploma. They were going to be maids, janitors, field workers, street cleaners, plus high school diplomas in those days meant something important. So that was a resistance to this school going up. Later on, other black high schools were built. One in Coconut Grove, Carver, one down south, Mays, But these schools came along later and with resistance civically. I should also mention that when this school opened, Black teachers and white teachers were paid different rates of pay. The school system in Dade County paid Black teachers considerably less because, in the words of the superintendent at the time, Black teachers were not as well prepared as were white teachers. So it was really into the 1960s before equal pay among teachers became a reality. This is Christian Hospital, speaking of realities. When Overtown started, there was no hospital for Black people. If you got very sick, they would let you be admitted to a shed in the back of Jackson Hospital. And that was where Black people went. And you couldn't go into the main building unless it was at night or weekends when white people were out. If you were a Black physician, and we did have Black doctors in Miami early on, you could not operate without a white physician being in the operating room. Most Black babies were born at home by midwives. The death rate of Black children was higher for that reason, because of the lack of the absence of appropriate hospital care when there was a need for such a thing, when babies were being born. So a white woman donated this land for the building of a Black hospital, Christian hospital, and that was opened in the 1930s, which finally offered medical treatment to Blacks. I should mention that even though Blacks could not be admitted to Jackson Hospital, Black nurses could not work there as well. Thelma Gibson, the wife of Father Theodore Gibson, the second Black person to serve in the Miami City Commission, was the first nurse who was allowed to work at Black nurse who was allowed to work at Jackson Memorial Hospital. That's the police precinct in Overtown. Before I talk about that, let me just mention before I forget where the name Overtown came from. If you lived in Coconut Grove and you wanted to visit relatives or friends who lived in Colored Town, you had to go over downtown to get to the Negro section of Miami. Thus the term Overtown applied to what they were talking about. There were no Black police officers in Miami until into the 1940s. So the police who policed Overtown were white, and they were untrained officers. When the city of Miami established the first police department, they brought in white men from Georgia, no training, gave them billy clubs, badges, guns, and sent them to Overtown, Colored Town, to enforce the law. And they were ruthless. The problem of Black community police relations goes back to the very first police who came into Miami, who were brought to Miami to enforce the law. Miami finally got Black police officers in the 1940s, and they couldn't arrest white people. The first Black patrolman could not arrest white people. If you saw someone breaking the law, a white person, you had to call a white cop to arrest them. One of the reasons they put this building up was because so many Black folks were in jail every Monday that it was overwhelming the jail downtown. So the Blacks need their own jail. So they built this precinct and also had a Black judge, Judge Thomas, Lawton Thomas, to be the one who handled these cases in Overtown. When they finally did hire Black police officers, I think around 1947, under a lot of pressure to do so, the officers didn't have benefits, as did white officers, no pensions and what have you. All of that came later. And the first Black police officers who were hired had to be hired secretly. They were sworn in the basement of the county building and were kept hidden until they thought the public would finally accept these men with limited policing roles. This is a train leaving Miami in 1948 for New York. But this gives you an idea of how Black people had to ride in segregated rail cars back in the day. And this continued into the 1960s. The white folks rode in cars much more comfortable than these. The black coach, the black car on a train was always the one right behind the engine, not the one in the back, right behind the engine where the cinder, the smoke, and all that fell on the car that the black folks were riding in. The Klan was in Miami early on in 1917, 1920. We had all kinds of Klan activity in Miami, including an occasional ride through Town. They would mount up and ride through Overtown wherever they wanted to. Black people often knew they were coming before they even came, because Black maids and givers in Black homes and white homes heard about these Klan rides and warned the community before they would. This is a dummy that was hung in Overtown in 1929, a very contentious city election. And to try to intimidate Black voters, they hung these things on telephone poles in Overtown. It didn't work. It backfired. More Black people voted in that election than had voted any time before that. Any attempt to really suppress the Black vote really usually backfires, the same as it did in the last presidential election. This picture was taken in South Dade. It's a Klan baby being introduced into the Klan. I just thought it was interesting to point out that the introduction of racist feelings and attitudes begins very, very early on in life. This is just one example of it. That's the Ward rooming house in Overtown. That's where a lot of Black entertainers and athletes stayed when they came to town. They could not stay on the beach. They could not stay in white hotels. So many of them stayed in this Ward rooming home, which has been rooming house, which has been restored by the city of Miami. That's Billie Holiday on the left in Miami. She was among the many, many stars who came and visited Miami and was popular here. And she performed in Miami as well. This is a women's social club that is having her at a tea in her honor. That's Joe Louis with Dr. William Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer was one of the first physicians, Black physicians in Miami. His family owned the Mary Elizabeth Hotel downtown. He's shaking hands with Joe Louis, who stayed at the hotel. As I mentioned earlier, Black people had to stay in these very, very restricted areas when they came into Miami. This is a picture you should pay attention to. That's Town, Overtown, during the heyday. Look at those buildings. The leading cause of death of Black children in these early years was fire. When one of those buildings caught on fire, a lot of people died because they couldn't get out of them. They were traps. These were not the kinds of housing that Mr. Dorsey built. These were built by white landowners who wanted to make a lot of money by crowding a lot of folks into an area and then charging high rent. And that's how Miami evolved. That's how Overtown evolved. So even though we know about the heyday and all of that, this is what was going on behind the scenes. People were struggling to survive. And then this happened. That's the Liberty Square housing project in Liberty City. Crowding in Overtown was so bad that eventually this public housing project, the second one built in the country, Liberty Square, was built in order to take some of the housing problems out of Overtown and give people a choice to live someplace else. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in Miami in 1933, right before he took office, and he saw how bad things were in Overtown, and said he was going to do something about it when he got to Washington. And what President Roosevelt did was authorize the construction of this project. And Black folks finally could vote as Democrats in the 1950s. For that, they had to vote as Republicans. The reason this is significant is that once the Democratic Party was forced by court order to accept Black people, a lot of Black people registered as Democrats. So Democrats began to have power, political power in the South, in Florida, and particularly in certain counties like Broward County and Dade County, where there were a lot of Black folks who became Democrats. And therefore, that empowerment led to better lives for all of us. Now, I want to take just a couple of minutes, even though we're finished with the slides, to talk about a couple of things about Overtown, and we'll probably have to close out in just a few minutes. My family came to Overtown in 1951 when I was 11 years old. We stayed in Overtown for about 2 or 3 months before we moved to North Dade County. And my reflections of Overtown in 1951 still stay with me. The smell of baking bread. There was a bakery in Overtown. And every morning you'd smell the bread just all through the community. That was what you would wake up to. There was no crime that I knew of. The police, I remember the police going up and down the street. And if you were a Black man sitting on your porch Monday morning at 9, 10 o'clock, the police would stop and ask you what you were doing there. Because the police were very, very suspicious of Black men who didn't appear to have jobs. So they would make you leave your porch and go inside rather than sit outside on your porch and having it be very clear to everybody that you were not working. There were no apartment buildings, as I recall. Those came later. People lived in, some of them had 2-story homes, but no apartment buildings. Very, very little conflict. No murders, no violence, domestic problems, of course. But that was the way in which Overtown impressed me. So my first television set in Overtown, 1951. And then we moved out of the community. Overtown was doing just fine. Well, it was doing fine in the sense that some Black people were making money and being able to move out once integration came. It was not doing fine in the sense that some Black people never managed to rise out of the poverty that I just showed you that was endemic in that community. Why and how Overtown was never able to really advance the poorest in that community is another discussion. I'll just close out by saying that the interstate came through, I-95 came through in 1957. I was away at college when they started it. And I came back, it was finished in 1961. And when they put that interstate through Overtown, it displaced almost 40,000 people in the space of less than 5 or 6 years. Those people went north. Many of them went to that housing project, Liberty Square. Many of them started to branch out in Opelika, North Dade, Miami Gardens. And that was the death knell to Overtown, that expressway. We still have not recovered. And now with gentrification, people crowding in and demand for housing coming from Hispanic residents and from white people who want to be near downtown, Overtown is threatened by gentrification. In another 20 years, you may not see a Black person in Overtown. The Lyric Theater and a couple of other historic marking buildings maybe, but I think the community itself is in threat of disappearing as we know it. There were 2 riots in Overtown. I won't mention the 1980 riot. That happened mostly in the city, but there were 2 events in Overtown that I should mention because people forget that we have these things happen. I'm not sure how much time we have left. All right. Now let me talk about what happened in 1982 and 1989 in Overtown. There were 2 riots. One of these took place in 1982. It became known as the Neville Johnson incident. Neville Johnson was a young black man who was playing games on a video game room in Overtown on 3rd Avenue when a white police officer named Luis Alvarez approached him. Alvarez wanted to show a rookie cop who was with him how to go into a black establishment and check it out. And he saw what appeared to be a bulge in Neville Johnson's pocket. And Neville was playing his video game. And Alvarez walks up and puts his pistol to the boy's head and tells him, "Don't move." And of course, he moved his head and the gun went off and blew his brains out. And that started a riot in Overtown that caused a lot of damage to the community. No one died, but it added the sense in the broader community that Overtown was a dangerous place. After the 1980 riot, in which Arthur McDuffie was killed, that was the view of Liberty City. It's too dangerous, people up there riot. Now we had one in 82 in Overtown, and another one in 1989, the so-called Lozano incident. Lozano was a white police officer who, in 1989, was policing Overtown with a partner, a white police officer, female officer, named Dunn Campbell. And the two of them were given a report of some men fleeing on a motorcycle in Overtown, heading north up 3rd Avenue. So Lozano hears a motorcycle coming in his direction, steps out into the middle of 3rd Avenue. He was a marksman and fired one shot at this motorcycle that's approaching him with two men on it, Alan Blanchard and Clement Lloyd. And his shot struck the driver in the head and he was killed immediately. The bike keeps going a few yards. The other person, the rider, is alive, but the bike strikes a car. And now they're both dead. And that started yet another disturbance in Overtown. Again, adding to the idea that this was not a safe community. Overtown has a, I'm sorry? Yeah. So let's talk about the future of Overtown. Overtown faces its greatest threat through gentrification. Overtown's problem is it's located close to the ocean. You could walk to the bay in a few minutes. Overtown's problem is that a lot of people want to live near downtown or in downtown, and there's no room. So these condominiums are marching west towards Overtown. They have crossed the railroad track. So now if you stand anywhere in the center of Overtown and look around, you're standing at a canyon that's getting taller and taller. What do you do about that? The city, county, public entities say, well, we'll make these builders set aside a certain number of apartments for low-income people. Hardly ever works out. People they want to have move in who are low income can't afford to live in these buildings. So what's the solution to gentrification? I don't have a solution to that. People own these properties privately, they can do whatever they want. There were white people who bought up land in Overtown 40 years ago and just banked it for this very moment. And they knew they could make a killing off of Overtown property. This is one of the difficulties when you have a people who are essentially landless. But that's another presentation for another time. Gentrification is our greatest threat right now. And I do believe that the population of Overtown will diminish in terms of its Black component until the point that it can hardly tell Overtown ethnically, racially from any other part of life. It makes me wish for the days of Good Bread Alley. That's what they call that section of Overtown where the bakery was located. Waking up to the smell of baking bread is a lot better than waking up to the sound of gunfire. Thank you for your attention and have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn, for your thought-provoking assessment of the history of Overtown, past and present. We truly appreciate you joining us today. Students, also don't forget that we have a post-event survey. You'll find a link below. Please fill it out for a chance to win a set of JBL speakers. And as always, to stay in tune with student life, follow us on our social media pages. Make sure that you pay attention to the rest of the events for February, as well as the rest of our Black History Month events college-wide. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a fabulous Seahawk Day. Bye.